Hello and welcome to my video on layers. Layers are really important. They can save you a lot of time both now and in the future, and it's really good practice to use them. But if you're just going to be practicing drawing entities pretty much like we have in all the tutorials up to now, then don't worry about them. You know, if it's just practice, you're not doing work for someone else, you haven't got to supply the drawing, just get stuck in and do what you got to do and don't waste time with layers. But once you start to actually modify drawings and will be supplying your drawing to a client, then you really need to have some layer management. If you were to just do your modification without any thought to the layers and you just used whatever layers set, so essentially you're using whatever layers came with the drawing, and then at a later time wanted to separate your drawing from theirs, you'll find it very difficult because it's all mixed up. If you would use layers, then all you've got to do is isolate those layers, lift your drawing off, stick it on the new one that you may have been supplied with or are proposed, and it takes seconds. If you don't, then you've got to actually separate it by selecting all your bits and pieces, putting them on layers and then lifting them, and that's going to take you hours. And also your client will really appreciate that you've used layers because he may have to do the same job. You send your modified topo to a client, he sends it to his architect, and the architect wants to lift your tree layer and stick it on his proposed, but he can't because you've mixed it all up and he can't separate the two easily. He's got to go around and spend an hour or so picking out all your bits and pieces and shoving on a layer, and he won't be very happy with you. So layers are really important and they save a lot of time, and your client's going to appreciate them, and you'll appreciate receiving drawings that have got good layer management. So what is a layer? It's really just a property, a tag for an entity. Every entity, like this line, in its properties has a layer property, and this layer is called elevation. So this line is on the elevation layer. And you can't draw anything without it having a layer. It will always assign whatever is the current layer. And if you hit your escape button, so nothing's selected, and look at this layer box on the home tab here, that is the current layer at the moment. So whatever I draw will be assigned that layer, which is 0. And this drop down box, drop down menu, shows all the layers on the drawing, and they're nicely organized. Just a simple word or two to describe them. When you select an entity, it will show the layer of that entity in the drop down box as well as on your properties. If I hit the escape button, if I select two entities, because they're both on the same layer, it still shows the layer up there. But if I click something else on a different layer like the tree, it goes blank because they can't show multiple layers, and it's saying varies in the properties. And this menu can be a bit confusing if you don't quite understand how it works. So I'm hitting the escape button, nothing's selected, it shows the current layer. If I select a layer from it, it's changed to station. I've changed the current layer to station, so whatever I draw now will be using the station layer because there's its layer on the properties of the circle. But if I have something selected, it's showing me that that's called fence boundary. If I now select something else from the menu, it's actually changed the thing I'd selected to the new layer. If I now hit the escape button, it's gone back to the current layer of station, and the menu has changed the layer of the polyline, which used to be for the fence. And that's what you need to remember. When nothing's selected and you change the menu setting, it will just change the current layer. So whatever you draw will use that layer. But if you've got something selected, like services, it's showing the layer of the entity. If I hit escape, it goes back to buildings. I select the entity, it's showing me that that is using services. If I now select something else while that's been selected, it changes the layer of the entity. And as soon as I hit escape, it goes back to the current layer. So this has now been changed to veg. And it's easy once you get used to it. Once you've sort of tried playing with it a few times, you'll easily understand it. At the same time, I can select an entity. Now that's just showing me that that entity is in waterways. It's not the current layer. The current layer is buildings because I've deselected it. But I can also click this thing here which says make current. So I've selected this entity which is waterways, and I want that to become the current layer. So I hit make current. And now when I hit escape to cancel any selection, the current layer is now waterways. So whatever I draw now will be on the waterways layer. And that's really useful for when you want to draw something using a certain layer, rather than hitting escape and then trying to find it, because you may have 100 layers on here and you've got to work through this list. It's easier just to select an entity and hit make current, and now that's your current layer and you can draw using that current layer. So moving on to the sort of settings within this menu, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 little settings next to it, and they all do different things. And the first one, if you just mouse over, it says turn a layer on or off, and that's all it basically does. If I switch off the elevation by hitting this little light bulb, it gives me a warning because it's the current layer. So I'll just say yeah, carry on with that. And it's turned off the elevation layer. Now the elevation were for these sort of house fronts in neighbouring gardens. If I turn it back on, you'll see them appear. I'll use a different one that isn't current so we don't get that warning. I'll do the trees. I'll switch the tree layer off and all the trees disappear. Turn them back on and they come back. And that's really handy, especially when you've got a topographical survey, you've got old canopies on from the topo, you've put your new canopies on, you want to turn the topo canopies off. All you got to do is hit that and they've gone. They haven't been deleted, they'll still be saved with the drawing, but they're just not being drawn on the screen. And then the next one is freeze or thaw. It's a strange name. I think they should have just called it advanced on off or something, but there you go. It's freeze or thaw, and it works pretty much the same way. If I hit the little ice or sun or ice, I don't know what it is, so it becomes an ice crystal, the trees have disappeared, and it works in exactly the same way as on off, because it is basically an advanced on off, and you can have them both if you like. So what's the difference between freeze and thaw? And I'll show you that by, I'll just delete these things. Keep the drawing a bit tidy. If I draw a big entity up here, and I'll stick that on let's say the waterway layer. Hit escape, and I'll just unfreeze the trees so we can see everything. So if I go zoom, right click extents, AutoCAD shows all the entities and fills the screen with them, because I've said zoom the extents of the drawing as best it can. If I select waterway and turn it off, so my little river down here is gone and that big square is gone, and hit zoom extents, it's still zooming as if that square, that rectangle was there. So it's still processing it, it's still using memory and processing time, but it's just not showing it on the screen. If I switch it back on, and this time I'll freeze the waterway layer, so they've disappeared again, and go zoom extents, it's now only displaying the extents of the unthawed layers, because this layer has been frozen. Did I say unthawed? Thawed layers. So it's not showing it, the frozen layer. It's a very confusing name. So this time it's not actually processing that rectangle. It's completely ignoring it. It's not sort of using up memory and processing time dealing with it. It's just doing those which are thawed. And that's the whole point of the freeze setting. It saves processing time, doesn't use as much memory. So in situations where you may have a massive drawing which perhaps you've been supplied with, and your computer's struggling, you know, it's taking ages just to display the screen and do things, and you've got lots of layers switched off, well, use freeze instead, and that will just speed up the processing, because it won't even sort of look at them at all. I personally always use freeze. It's just habit. I don't use on off. If I need to hide layers, I'll just hit the freeze. Now the next thing we've got here is lock. If I mouse over that, it says lock or unlock a layer, and it just basically does what it says. It locks a layer and won't allow you to do anything to that layer. If I lock the roads layer, and these are the roads, and I can select them, and I'll hit delete button, but it won't tell me. It says erase one found, but it was on a locked layer, so it hasn't erased it, and it's saying give me some more. I'm still trying to do the roads. I can erase that building, but I can't do the roads because they're on a locked layer. And in the same way, I can't copy a road, it won't let me. So that's what it does, and it can be very handy. We'll be looking at isolate in a minute, and that automatically uses the locked function. So let's have a look at the last little thing here, which is a color box, and it's basically allows you to set the color of the layer. So if I go for, I'll unlock the roads while we're at it, and let's go for buildings. I'll click that, and I can select the color of the buildings, and all my buildings have changed their color to blue, and that's really useful function. If you've got 150 trees on your drawing and you've used a layer to hold the canopy, you can just change the canopy layer by clicking that box to maybe a different shade of green or whatever you like, and all the trees will change with it, and it can save you an awful amount of time, because otherwise you'd have to go either select them all and then change the colour, or do it individually. But it only works if you have set the entity colour to by layer. So if I select this section, this bank of the river, the colour is set to by layer, which means I want that entity to use the layer colour. If I override that and use a different colour, then this section is using by layer, but this one has been overridden and I've told it to use colour red. Some instances it's handy to do that, and I'll show you in a sec, but generally I would say use by layer where you can, because it is a big time saver. And you simply just click that, and at the top it will be by layer, or you can select a predefined colour or go into the colour box. So I'll put that back to by layer and it uses the layer colour. I'll just load in, I added some tree survey to this drawing just to sort of demonstrate, and I've added 4 layers to the other layers which are there, and I've called them Arb Survey, Canopy, RPA, Symbol and Text. So these are my tree canopies. The layers come up, they're set to by layer. So going back to what we just talked about, I can change the colour of all the tree canopies just by a couple of clicks. And I can hide the topo tree canopies by either freezing or turning them off. I'll freeze them and they've disappeared. They're not deleted, they're still there if we want to show them again. And on my trees I've got the RPA circle, the canopy, the Arb Survey text, and I have got the Arb Survey symbol. And what I normally do is have a little black ring with a colour blob inside. If I can just select it, there you go. And this blob is a donut, it's a polyline, but it's actually a donut, and we've looked at that in a past tutorial if you want to look at that. If your circles don't show as proper circles, and it normally applies to polylines, so you can see it's a sort of, I don't know if it's a hexagonal or a bit higher, just type REA, which is to regen the drawing, and it will regenerate it. But with the text I can change the colour fine, and the RPA I can change the colour because I've set them all to by layer. But on the symbol, actually the symbol ring, which is the circle around this donut, is set to white or black depending on what your background colour is, and the actual symbol colour is over into blue. So these don't actually use, any of these two don't use by layer. If I were to set that to by layer, it's now taking on the colour of the layer, which is black. I'll just hit undo. And the reason for that is because with BS 5837 tree surveys, we represent a tree by a category, and they can be green, blue, grey or red. Now I could have 4 layers. I could have Arb Survey symbol A, and then another one with B, another C and U, with the colour for each. But I wanted to just keep the layers down a bit, so in this case I've overridden the layer colours, and set the A trees to green, and the blue, the B to blue, C to grey, etc. So that's one case where I've overridden the layer colour. And of course I'll be in trouble if I wanted to change all my category colours. I'd have to go around and physically do it. If I wanted that to become a different shade of blue, it won't change the other ones. I've now got to physically go around and change all those. I could use match properties and it will just whack the colour in for me. But you can see straight away how that's wasting time. So if it were a huge tree survey, then it would really pay to have 4 layers here instead of just the one. So it'd be Arb survey symbol A, B, C and U with the colours, so I can set them by layer. And the little black ring around the outside, that can just stay as white because that won't change. So before we go and look at sort of actual naming the layers, let's look at the rest of this menu. And I don't actually use most of this. I use make current, I use isolate and unisolate. They're really important. Make current is very handy. I don't use any of these. When I want to do these sort of things, I'll go into the layer properties box, which we're looking at in a while. So what does layer isolate do? It isolates a layer. If I click on roads and hit isolate, in reality it's locked all the other layers but kept the roads unlocked. So if I now were to select everything on the drawing and copy it, it's only copying the layer I isolated. And once you've finished doing whatever you do, you must hit unisolate to unlock all the other layers. And isolate is really, really handy because I can simply select my items on a tree survey, and you can select multiple items with different layers. It's gone blank to show that they're all different. I can hit isolate. I can now select it, the whole drawing, copy, unisolate, and I've just extracted the isolated layers, and I could move them onto a different drawing. And this is sort of what I was saying at the beginning, where if you don't use layers and you mix your drawing in, you know, if you had used a building layer or whatever for all your tree work and you tried to lift your tree work, you'll be lifting all the buildings as well. So use layers, even if it's just one. One is better than nothing. Just have one layer as tree survey and put everything on it. You'll probably regret it later on when you want to change things, because you then have to separate your items, but it's better than, certainly better than nothing. And that's really what isolate is all about. Now there's one danger with isolate, and that is if you were to isolate, say I isolate the buildings, and then I hit isolate again, because at the moment it's locked all the other layers except buildings. But if I hit isolate again, that's no problem. I'll copy whatever I've isolated. There they come, the buildings. And then I hit unisolate. But when I now try and select something else, like the tree, it's telling me, the mouse is telling me that it's locked. The layer's been locked. If I look at the properties, let's look at it on here, they're all still locked, even though I unisolated. So I'll hit it a couple more times, but they're still all locked. And that is the danger of hitting isolate twice without using an unisolate first. Because when you isolate, it makes a quick record of the state of the layers, and when you hit unisolate, it restores that. But if you hit isolate on an isolated layer, I know this sounds confusing, it's overwriting its sort of saved states, and it's recording all the locked layers as its unisolated to be unisolated state. Yeah, it sounds confusing, doesn't it? But basically what it means is you must always hit unisolate after an isolate when you finish doing what you're doing. And the only way to restore this is to just switch all these back on, or go into the layer properties box, Control A, unlock everything, and everything's sorted out. So that's the isolate and unisolate. And as I said, I don't use anything else. You can mouse over and see what they do. This will turn all layers on. Use it with care, because if you have set your sort of topo with layers hidden, the last thing you want is to suddenly turn them all on and regret that. And these work in much the same way. I don't use them. I use this, as I said before. So I just use the make current and the isolate unisolate. Now before we go and look at the layer properties box, there's one more thing I want to look at, which is down here. So what I'll do, I'll just close these drawings and open one up afresh. So what we got down here on this little drop down menu is a way to store your layer states. Oops. These are your layer states. Whatever you set on here are your layer states. I've just turned off the fence and services. If I come down here, click this, I can create a new layer state, and I'll just go new and give it a name. I'll call it base settings. And that is now, the base settings has now recorded all these layer states. So if I now go in here and change them all, mess about a bit, yep, turn that off, let's do a few more, get rid of the trees as well, oops, let's turn them off, there you go. So that's what I've changed everything to. Maybe there's some reason I wanted to do that. Maybe I just wanted to isolate a little bit of the drawing. So I've turned a lot of things off, frozen a lot of things. I finished doing what I'm doing. I want to go back to all my settings. You just have to select your base settings, and it restores all your settings to what they were when you saved them. And that can be really handy in certain situations. And such a situation is what we did before, where we isolated the tree layers. I'll just turn all these on. Let's say we wanted to lift this tree layer off, and before I just selected the 4 items that make up the layers. If you've got lots of tree layers, maybe 10, 12, because you've added lots of variants, you have to make sure that you select every single item of those sort of 12 layers. You might have to hunt around and find them and then isolate them, otherwise they won't all be isolated. You must select the 12 items that represent the layers you want to isolate. and that can take a bit of time sometimes to find them, and of course it's not very efficient. It's much better to make a new layer state, let's say org state. So it's now recorded these layer states, and I can then go through and freeze everything else. Now we would do this normally in the properties box, which we're going to look at. So I switched all the other layers off in one way or another and only left with our tree layers, and I can then just select them, copy them, whatever, and then just go back to the org state and everything's restored to the way we left it. And of course some of these may have been switched off as part of that original state, so that's the other use for it. And rather than using isolate, you can just store your settings, switch what you want on, and then reset them. So let's look at the properties box, the layer properties, and what we have here are a few more little controls and things. You've got your layers listed. These follow the same arrangement as this. You've got on, freeze, lock. Well, you've actually got plot squeezed in there between the colour. The plot allows you to switch a layer off from being printed out. So if you're creating a PDF or printing to paper and you find bits are missing on your drawing, just check that the layer hasn't been disabled from printing. Check there's no little red line on there. And then you've got line type, which, like colour, is the layer line type, and you can override it. Now this service wire I've got as dashed. I can set that, just like the colour, I can set it to by layer, and it's become solid, because the surfaces on the layer are continuous or solid. If I change that to dashed, even though this is set to by layer, it's using the dashed line type from the surfaces, while this one is set individually, but I can't set it by layer. Now I don't normally use line type on the layer because there's no scaling factor for them. You can't scale things like on individually like this. This is set by layer. This one, if I change the scale because I want bigger dashes, I can't do that on with the layer settings. So I generally do all my line types individually, but providing you've got everything on layers, as we spoke before about isolating, you can just isolate a layer. For instance, all this fencing, I can isolate the layer, select everything, set the line type to whatever I want. That's just telling me that it can't apply that to the things which have been ignored by the isolate. So all those on the lock layers have been ignored. It likes to tell you things like that. And then hit escape and unisolate. I've now set all the lines on that isolated layer to dashed. So that's the line type, and you got line weight, which works the same as the other two. It just allows you to add some thickness to your lines, text or whatever. I use line weight by layer all the time. I use colour and line weight, and I'll show you how that works. If I switch on an entity and stick some line weight on it, it sort of highlights it, adds a bit of thickness. And if you do that by layer, let's do the roads. All my roads are really nice and thick now. And it's just like the colours, it's a time saver rather than doing them individually. You may have to sort of separate one or two out if you want them to have different line weights, but generally it's a good idea to have all your entity line weight settings set to by layer. And now we've got transparency. This is one I very rarely use, and if I were to use transparency at all, I'd probably do it individually because it would just be the odd bit of hatching or something. So it's best to keep these at 0, which is fully opaque. Transparency, if I was to draw, I'll just draw a little box over this section. And while we're just on the subject of line weight, you've got a setting down here which is show or hide line weight. I'll just switch it off so that's not glaring at us. But if I hatch this box, and I've got it set to select objects, I'll pick the box edge and set it to solid, and let's give it a colour. And what you'd normally do is send it to the back, so it's behind everything. But in some situations, especially with a complex proposed drawing which has already got lots of hatching on it, putting it behind completely hides it because there's other hatches on top of it. So you have no choice really but to have it at the front. And that means, of course, everything under it is hidden because this is a solid hatch. So you can give it some transparency. And the value is between 0 and 90. 0 is opaque, 90 is really translucent. So you'd normally sort of go somewhere in between. But it just sort of shows a bit in the background, lets it come through. And that's really the only time I use transparency, and I can't ever imagine using it on a layer so everything is set to a certain transparency. Let's just do something for fun. RPA. Let's set that transparency to 56. So straight away you can see all my RPAs have gone a little bit dimmer. I can't imagine using that at all, but that's what it is. And then you've got the new VP free setting, which I'm not going to get into. I don't think you'll ever use it. I don't use it. And you can add some text or description, which again probably haven't got time to do. So that's really what this box is about. You can set up filters to show certain to put them sort of into areas of display, because if there are hundreds of layers, and there can be on some drawings, you know, you've got a long list to go through each time. But what I want to look at now is adding a new layer, because that's really what this is all about. And up here you've got new layer, VP frozen all viewports. Don't bother with that. Delete a layer and make a layer current. So if you just select a layer on here, you've got a little green tick thing there. That's showing you what's current. As you can see, it's current here. If I select an RPA and say make current, the little green tick has moved down to the Arb survey RPA. So you can do it from this box, but to make a new layer you just click that and add whatever text you want in there. I'll put in new layer. You can use spaces, dashes. I always use underscore. And set its color, etc. And while you're at it, you can make it the current one, so that when you start drawing, everything's using your new layer. And really it's as simple as that. I would just say, think about your names. It's best to use a sort of group name, if you like, to cover everything, to keep them together. If I just had canopy, RPA symbol and text, they'd be spread out through the list and you'll be hunting around through a long list of layers to find them. So if you sort of put like Arb or tree survey at the beginning, they'll stay together. And Arb is convenient because it means they'll be near the top of the list, which again is really handy. You don't have to keep scrolling down a long list of layers to find your layers. So starting it with Arb or ATS, Arb tree survey, so you could have ATS and then followed by canopy, RPA, etc. So, and don't make them too long. There's nothing worse than really long layer names, so they don't all show in this box. Keep them short and sweet, and a good description of what actually you're using it for. So like roads is for roads, canopy is for canopy. And on your layer list, you'll always have a layer 0. This is a sort of default AutoCAD layer. There has to be at least one layer on a drawing, so it always creates layer 0. And you can use it, you can set your colours, etc., but you can't rename it. It won't let you. And you can't delete it. It says no. But it's always there. On every drawing you'll have a layer 0, and if you create a new drawing, it's just got one layer to start you with, and it's layer 0. So let's have a quick look at why you should use layers. Let's do a worst case scenario, and it's a bit extreme, but here you have a drawing. Now, topographical surveys, and this is actually quite a good one. All the lines are joined up. Sometimes you'll see gaps everywhere, but this is quite a good survey, and it will have lots of layers on it. This one has only got one. And what normally happens is a topographical survey supplied to the architect. The architect can take it and he selects everything and he puts it on one layer and sets it to one colour and uses that as a sort of background of his proposed drawing, which will be on top of it. And then he sends all that to your client, who sends it to you and says, yep, go out and do a tree survey, here's the CAD. And he's given you a sort of modified version of the topo where everything's on one layer. So you ask him, oh, can I have the original topo? Client goes back to the architect. Architect says no, lost it, can't find it, whatever, you're stuck with this. And you've done your tree survey on all these trees and you want to get rid of all these canopies, but they're all on one layer. Normally you could have just selected it, switched the layer off. You can't do that here because it will turn everything off. And you've got to now either leave the canopies on and tell the client why and say it's going to cost him an extra hour's time for you to sort all these out, or you've got to go around and select all these bits of canopy delete them or stick them on a new layer and hide them. But as you can see, all these probably generated by a computer program, because there are lots of tiny bits of line there. They've been exploded perhaps from polylines, and it is going to take you absolutely ages to fish out all these little bits of canopy to get rid of them. And that is why we use layers. If we look at another sort of situation where you need to sort out a topo, we look at this is an old MOD site. It's been completely knocked down and rebuilt now, but this was HMS Mercury. It was I think it was a signals training station, inland of course, even though it's HMS, and it's got a few layers, not that many, and I can select, say, the grid and hide it, because you don't normally show the grid on your drawings. That's great. I can, perhaps I've plotted my trees, I want to hide all the trees, switch them off, great. But I've got all these tree heights which I don't want on the drawing. They've been put on by the topo people. There's no need to show them, they're not always that accurate. And if you click on one and look at the layer, it's got vegetation. But if I click at something else, like the name of this building, that's also on the same layer as vegetation, as are other things, like car park, that's on vegetation. So it's going to be a bit difficult to separate these by layer. So what I can do, I can, as we've discussed, I can create a base layer which records all my states, and then I can go into here, Control A, turn everything off except for vegetation. Whoops, still selected all. Vegetation, now turn them on. So all I've got is the text on there. And now I can just go through and delete them. Or I can put them on a new layer if I preferred. I could go back into here, create a new layer, tree heights, switch it on, close that, and I can just simply select and put them on the new layer. And if I was to change that colour to say red, and because they're not by layer, they've all been set to colour 253, which is a sort of grey. If I selected everything and said by layer, then I can see which ones I've done. So I can carry on picking them out. It's all time consuming, obviously, but you never know, you might need them for some reason, or worst cases, the client will say, oh, can you put those heights back on please? You've deleted them or you've got to get them all back. So it's always best to try and keep things. Now there's other ways around this. You could do a search and sort of delete them that way, but like I said, if you've got to keep them, then there's really no other option but to manually go around and chuck them all on a layer, which you can then turn off later on, but it's always there if you needed it. But by removing all the other layers, you're not going to keep catching other things as you do these selections. You can do them quite quickly. So it's just sort of showing how, you know, using a bit of layer management can save you time. So I'm not going to do them all, it's just and then you would go back to your layer states, click base again, all the text has come on, but it's actually turned off my tree heights because that wasn't part of the layer states we saved. If I turn them on, you can see there they are, and turn them off. And these have now, all the text has been set to by layer, so I can change the layer to something a little bit more suitable. And you know, if you do find the odd one now and then, even though you've tried to do them all, you can but you will get a little box telling you what's happened each time. That's the annoying thing. Conifer text is on tree, it's on a different layer, so that's fine. But again, if you wanted to get rid of that, you can just switch off that layer. They're gone. And that's really what about managing a topo is. You know, you need to remove a lot of stuff that's unnecessary, that distracts from your drawing. And that's it really for this video. It's been a bit long-winded, but I hope it gives a sort of overview of layers and how handy they are and how important they are to use them. So thanks very much and see you on the next one. Bye!